look into the future, what do you see? I really need to know now, is there a place for me? If we're gonna survive, the dream must stay alive.
Authorities are appealing for calm throughout the evacuation process.
The Tribe, A New World by A.J. Penn. Chapter 10. Bray trudged through the barren, charred wilderness, every muscle in his tired body aching, urged on by sheer willpower alone. Fatigue threatened his progress, tempting him to give in. Losing his footing, Bray tumbled and just managed to catch his fall, scratching his hands as he tried to land in a controlled manner, his fingers hitting some gorse plants, their bristles cutting into him. Bray winced, cursing his luck that out here, whatever here was, in the middle of nowhere, he should trip and fall onto one of the few plants that did manage to survive in this forbidden wasteland. The only question was, could he survive too? Once more, doubt entered his conscience. Give up, give in. What was the point in going on? Fighting back, dismissing the notion of surrender, Bray pushed himself up, regaining his footing. His right leg searing with pain, Bray yelled out in agony. He had cut himself in an earlier fall the day before, on a jagged rock. Feeling his gashed thigh gently, Bray guessed he had probably got an infection by now. He had tried to fashion a makeshift bandage out of his clothing, wrapping the ripped material on his wound, but there was little more he could do. Every so often, his wound resumed bleeding, his improvised bandage covered in red. With the bloodline of Bray, we are one with Zoot. Bray shook his head, dismissing Eloise's voice, the image of her cruel expression embedded deep within the recesses of his imagination. He hoped more than ever he had finally got away from her, would never see her again, or her crazed Zootist followers. Her experiments, the invasion of his very mind, through the many forays into reality space, sharing a virtual fantasy, they had all been insufferable, and even now had an effect. Bray once again had difficulty deciphering if his current predicament was real, or if he had been caught and was now trapped in a virtual reality simulation. What Bray had found even worse, harder to stomach, was the distortion of how he viewed his brother's legacy and life. Compared to how others he had encountered throughout his imprisonment seemed to think of Martin. Was Zoot a god? What had he done to deserve such worship? He was certainly troubled, disturbed, exalting his mantra of power and chaos. But Bray knew he was no monster. Deep down inside, Zoot was still Martin, Bray's brother. He had good in him, and they enjoyed a close relationship growing up. Surely the deep bonds of two brothers could never disappear. For all the confusion, having been subjected to all the simulation programs, Bray was sure he was close to Martin once. Wasn't he? Or had it all been programmed? A fantasy? To Bray, Martin would always be the quiet, shy young boy who loved his family and idolized his older brother. Martin would have been disgusted at the world that was taking shape after the adults had perished. With people like Eloise manipulating, pursuing selfish agendas, all too happy to trample on others to get their way. A warm breeze blew into Bray's face. Dry as he was, dehydrated, it only intensified his discomfort, as did the intense sun beating down. So used to being inside, the bright outdoor light hurt his eyes, the sun burning his skin. There was no shade or protection. There had been trees here in a different time, no doubt a continuation of the forest that must have grown there once before. Now only endless tree stumps remained, the ground charred in places, ashen. The topography was truly post-apocalyptic. Bray noticed what he perceived to be a huge, deep crater, and bypassed it for many hours, rather than risk scaling down and crossing the Mammoth Divide. It was as if some thermonuclear explosion had occurred, or a meteor strike. Something had happened. Parts of the soil were crystallizing. Swirling circular shapes rippled as if fossilized by an enormous shockwave. Bray felt, in a way, he was the only person left in the world. Though he had regained his freedom and was overjoyed to be away from Eloise, the isolation he now felt, his painful solitude, the awful predicament, was difficult to bear. There was nothing in this wilderness, just the great likelihood of a slow, painful death, either starving or succumbing to his infection. Continuing onwards with a limp, dragging his infected leg and trying to put most of his body weight on his other side, Bray's thoughts of his own mortality and his brother led him to recalling the funeral of Zoot. The memory was so clear to Bray, like he was there, remembering every detail, even though he knew it was all in his mind. Was he going to join his brother soon? Would anyone mourn his likely passing, or even know of it? What had happened to Amber? Bray wondered as he trudged on. She had been such a comfort to Bray then, at Zoot's funeral, and not long afterwards, throughout their time together as a couple, when they were very much in love. Had she survived the techno invasion? What of the baby? Last he saw, going through it in his mind, Amber had gone into labour before the technos captured him. He had left her in the barn, hearing the sounds of the technos playing as they flew over the city, beginning their invasion. Recognised by techno forces, Bray had been dragged, kicking and screaming, taken from Amber, away from the life he knew, the life he cherished. Bray had encountered many other fellow prisoners. He'd met up with KC and Alice in a slave camp prior to them being shipped to various locations for laboured servitude, and he heard tales from them that the Guardian had resurfaced somewhere, even that Ryan was still alive and had been transported somewhere overseas, where he had met up with Paul. In one of Bray's own camps, he was sure Tysan had been there previously. The description Bray's fellow slave gave certainly matched Tysan. News of Bray's tribe, the Mallrats, had also spread to so many other areas, and he was proud of their reputation and primarily aspiration of building a new world out of the ashes of the old. Bray himself had been passed from one group of oppressors to another, traded as a slave, exchanged like he was a piece of merchandise, not a fellow human being. He didn't know how long he had been under Eloise's sway at the compound in the mountains. His mind, his memories cluttered, conflicting images, sounds, assaulting his senses, creating almost a new reality. With the only constant being, he was unsure if he could rely on his recollections. But Amber had been real. Their love, He wouldn't forget her, even with the mental and emotional turmoils he had been subjected to under Eloise. He never knew what happened. There were rumours. Word that Amber had perished as well as lived, passed on from other prisoners he had encountered in his incarcerations. Alice and KC had heard talk that Bray had a daughter. In another camp, as Bray desperately pressed for more information, other prisoners remembered hearing somewhere about the leader of the Morats having a son. Twins. Others said the baby hadn't made it. Some told him Amber had died in childbirth. Bray would only know for sure what had happened to Amber and the baby if he saw them for himself, and he was determined for them to do so, to make it out of this hell he now found himself in. He couldn't yield. He had to survive. "Come on," Bray urged himself through cracked lips, his voice dry and hoarse. He was so thirsty. His last drink had been when it had rained the day before. He had walked around with his mouth open, catching the drops. He must have looked so stupid doing that. Bray laughed. How Amber would have laughed as well, he felt. But there was deception in the tone, a manic intensity.